Welcome, Ruth, to our In Conversation series. Ruth, you are a researcher here at the Centre for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender, and I'm interested to initially hear from you something about your growing up. You know, what kind of family did you grow up in? Mom, dad, siblings. Tell me a bit about your background.
Okay, so for me, my background is a bit interesting in the sense that I was born in Buhera, which is my rural area, and my mother had gone with my dad for, it was after New Year's, they'd gone home to just check up on everyone. We usually kept in touch with people in our rural area because that's where my parents also grew up, and they have a homestead. And then the 3rd of January, they've gone for New Year's. My mother gets into labor in the evening, and the next thing, I'm born.
At home?
At home, in the kitchen.
Oh, wow.
My mother's sister, right, was there when I was delivered. So my mom had visited my aunt, which is her sister, and then she went into labor, delivered early morning of the 3rd of Jan. My dad had to drive back to Harare to get our prep clothes because they'd just gone for for a day to just see people, and then that's when I was born. And I became the 5th born in a family of 5. So we're 3 girls and 2 boys. Both my parents were civil servants working for the government, my mother being a teacher, and my father used to work for the Raw District Council as a deputy executive officer there. Yes.
Thinking about the sort of gender influences or messages about gender that you got as you were growing up, I'm thinking already, 2 factors coming out, maybe the rural space and a family of mixed boys and girls. What would you say were the messages you were getting around gender, perhaps initially from your family, but then you could think broader than that too?
I think when I was growing up, I was not conscious of our gender disparities or gender differences between a boy child and a girl child when I was in my house. That's my immediate homestead. But the moment I went out, that's when those differences started to come out. What do I mean? So in our household, there was no boy or girl chore. Right?
Oh, really?
We all had to do. You're the one who slept in the bed. Who are you expecting to do your bed? You're the one who's eaten. Who are you expecting to clean your dishes? So we were brought up in that manner where all household chores, were not necessarily gendered. So you'd find my mom used to rear poultry. So we all went outside to look after the chickens, after the guinea fowls, and the turkey. That's like the things she used to raise at home as well. So in terms of the household chores at home, there was no gender differentiation. But when I went outside my house, I was conscious of what boys and girls could do. For example, boys could play with cars, and they could make cars, and you could play with a die. The tie, we called it die. So you draw a tie. But then girls, we would play with dolls. Those are the things we would do outside when we're playing. And you'd find that when we also were in the rural area, there are things that boys could do and girls could not do. Boys would go to herd the livestock, but girls would remain at home doing, the cleaning and the cooking. But when it came to farming, we would all go into the field and till the land together. So in terms of gendered roles, I think they varied in the spaces that I existed at a particular time, being in the urban setting with my parents or being in our rural homestead. Those were the differentiations that sort of like came out in our growing.
And what is interesting, I think also theoretically, if we think about gender or we think about how people talk about gender, they would say, but boys are naturally drawn to making cars and being in the fields and playing robustly, and girls are naturally drawn to be nurturing, playing with dolls and being in the home near the mom, maybe cooking and cleaning. What is your take on that?
Looking at the way I was brought up, I think my parents had decided earlier on that they did not want to conform to societal expectations. For example, my dad could change diapers, and his brothers were puzzled. I mean, even now when we're older, they comment about how, oh, you know, this one, he used to change diapers. He's always been doing chores together with his wife. So I think they had decided earlier on that they're not going to conform, because for them it's about being there for one another. It's a partnership. If one feels overburdened, then the other should always be there to step in. So there shouldn't be a time when one feels overburdened. And that then meant that we all had to do similar things. Playing with the cars, I used to play with the car as well. Riding a bike, I was taught earlier on how to ride a bike. It didn't matter whether I'm a girl or I'm a boy. We were even taught to be daring.
So, I mean, I want to come back to that theme of multiple influences that can shape one's gender story, but I've also got this hypothesis, I don't think I've really tested it out, which is that people who end up in gender activism often come from families where the parents quite consciously chose to not bring their children up in excessively gendered ways. Where do you think your parents' ideas came from? Why were they different from their peers?
To some extent, I think because they had gotten education, they were able to decide what kind of lifestyle would bring development to one's being. Right. By development, I mean obtaining your full potential. So you would find that whereas my cousins and everyone else were brought up to think that the role of a woman is to be domesticated and then you prepared to get married, my parents' marriage, you know, for my parents, marriage was not a deciding factor of your being. So for them, because they had been educated and were seeing the value of education in one's development, they were even able to tell in different spaces. So being in a rural area, they could tell this practice does not bring one's development, so we would not necessarily follow it. You would find in a church settings, because I was brought up in a Christian setting, you'd find that in a church setting, there are things that they would not subscribe to. I'll give you an example. So my parents go to a Pentecostal church, and when we were growing up, they used to, you know, say, boys, stand up, girls, stand up, look at each other, you know, you must marry within, you know, so that we sort of like indoctrination. That was the common theme of, you know, what is the purpose of people being together, you know, marry in between, build a church and build a faith and then build a family. So all that people centered around was just giving birth and having more and more people within the church setting, whereas my parents were concerned about making a difference in one's life, right? So you'd find that if they ever found somebody who was struggling, I mean, most of our cousins and relatives would be struggling. They had not gone to school and gotten educated as much as my parents did. So they would find that the thing they would help you with was not money, but sending you to school.
Right.
So you get enlightened.
Yes, yeah.
Right, and by being in school, you can get equipped with qualifications and skills that allow you to be self-sustainable, whether self-employed or getting a job in a formal sector. Yeah. So I think, in a way, those are things that opened my parents, being educated and seeing the value of education in transforming their lives. Remember I said they were raised in a rural area, but then they managed to migrate from the rural area into an urban setting in Chitungwiza, which is a peri-urban area, like 30 km outside of Harare. That's where they built their house there, and that changed their trajectory in life.
It's such a fascinating story, and a wonderful example of how the power of the beliefs of the parent can make a big difference. But I've got another theory, which I'm testing them out with you today, which is that even in a progressive home, there can be outside influences that shape one's gender journey. But I'm my theory is around the emergence of sexuality,
Okay.
particularly in the teenage years. That sometimes what happens is that your parents may have open ideas about gender, but when the idea that you are a sexual being starts to come into the picture, I think that family anxieties, parental anxieties, and social anxieties around about this emerging sexuality. Are you going to find the right partner, the partner of an opposite sex? Thoughts about that?
So I must be frank. Zimbabwe is a very conservative society. You know, that's the setting I was brought up in, and also being a Christian, which is also a conservative religion. You find that the ideas of sexuality that I was subjected to when I was growing up was one of heterosexual relations. That's what was normalized as what one ought to be. So as I was growing up, you know, start having my menstruation, you're told now, be careful when you play around with boys, because you might end up falling pregnant. And you also don't want to be married to a junkie. Right? So be careful of how you relate with boys. I was never told about be careful how you relate with girls, right? So it was already defined for me that my sexual orientation and affiliation, you know, in terms of attraction, should be towards an opposite sex. And I never questioned it, because you know how the environment I was socialized in, that was a normalized thing. So in a sense, I would say my parents are also conservative in that manner, and the settings they all exist in is quite conservative. But moving out of Zimbabwe, coming to South Africa, where it's much more of an advanced and open society. Sexuality is not as boxed as it is in Zimbabwe. It's quite fluid. One can choose, you know, their orientation based on whatever the choice they have. I then struggled initially, you know, almost like a cultural shock, where this has been heterosexual relations
and heteronormativity.
Yes, has had been the norm. One now has to find themselves. Fortunately, being brought up in a family where we were not used to doing and conforming to societal expectations, I then had to reconfigure my ideas and orientation around sexuality, to see that, you know what, I may not have been open or exposed to various sexualities that exist, but in essence we are all beings. And I must say, it has strengthened my ideas about gender. It has strengthened my ideas about humanity and sexuality, that sexuality is a social phenomenon, one which is learned, right, in a sense. So because I have been confined to heteronormativity, I should not then see the other as abnormal, but rather be open to the idea that we are all beings and can actually exist together. Yeah,
it's brilliant, and in a way gives me an opening to ask you about how you came to be sitting here in this center, focusing on sexualities and gender as a core part of its work. Can you reflect upon a little bit of your educational history, your study history, and what brought you to this center, and how much of your work is now focused on gender?
On gender. So I moved to South Africa 2008 to do my undergrad in political science, and that was by chance. Initially, I wanted to study environmental science because I had done my A-levels focusing on geography, Shona, and divinity. So I wanted to be in the, you know, environmental science field. My sister also did environmental science, so I thought that was my path. But then I couldn't get placed here at the University of Pretoria for that program. Instead, my next option was political science. And then I thought, I'm going to be a diplomat, but I didn't know what does that mean. I mean, like anyone else who does political science, they think they're going to become diplomats, right? And then I did my undergrad, completed in 2010. I did my honors. When I was doing my honors, I met my supervisor, Corey Villinger, and she was working on peace and conflict. I'm like, peace and conflict. Okay, let's see. And then I realized, wow, there is so much conflict in this world, right? We have our own personal conflict, but then it explodes, you know.
Yeah.
Now, how do we then manage all those conflicts that exist at different levels of society? Became a drive for me. And then I did my master's on transitional justice, looking at Zimbabwe, how they have not yet resolved the past injustices that have happened, which are politically, the Matabeleland case, right? That was my case study. And those are all, politically inclined injustices. But when you look into the kind of atrocities that happened, people were raped, people were tortured, and most of the victims were women and children. Now, there are gender dynamics that start to pop up, but I didn't know how to deal with them, right?
What lens do you
What
use?
lens to use? I'm a political scientist, right? We didn't have exposure to feminism and how to use feminism as a lens to understand conflict. So I then had to learn on the job, whilst I'm doing my studies. And hence I did my PhD. And when I finished my PhD, it's just so happened that the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender was embarking on a project, right, gender justice, which cuts across different kinds of injustices that exist in society, including the things I had dealt with in the conflict field. Right. Now, where do these things intersect? I've mentioned that some of the people I dealt with experienced rape, they experienced torture, and were abducted, and it includes women and children. So it's things like that then got me to delve deeper into how gender is a crucial element when we want to address conflict in society.
I have a sense, and I may be wrong because this is more your area than mine, but do you think there's a sort of a conventional view that women are either in conflict situations, they're either victims or they're peacemakers, and that men are perpetrators? Do you think that is in itself an unnecessary or unfair binary?
What makes us think that women are often the victims and peacemakers, whereas men are the perpetrators, is that the political space is dominated by men, right? If we're looking at a random case, a random search, how many female presidents do we have in the world, right? And we know that political decisions are made by politicians. And when wrong decisions have been made by politicians, the society suffers. Now, if most of the people making these decisions are men, by default, perpetrators become men, right? And then when we now look into the dynamics of society, there are more women than men globally, right? Then when violence is happening, these decisions have been made by men. Who is in society that is going to be affected in most cases? It becomes the women. So in a sense, it's almost a decision made from
structural.
It's a structural issue where we look at the population dynamics and who is at the echelons of power and who is at the bottom. Remember, we're in a patriarchal society as well, so women are right there at the bottom. Then people say women are peacemakers. Women are considered as peacemakers partly because you'd find that they are the ones that exist at home. You know how a woman is considered a homemaker per se, and the peacefulness of a home is considered her job, right? So if you end up having those characters in people, then on the one hand, when this woman has failed to, they say, bring peace to the home, then she's not a homemaker.
Right.
So in a sense, you could say it's probably just a myth, it's a fallacy. People assume those roles because of the gendered positions
Right.
that they've given to men and
And to
women.
women.
But you'd find that even in some cases where violence is happening, some women are involved in
Yes.
perpetrating
Yes.
violence. Yeah.
And also I'm thinking about the recent elections in Zimbabwe. I remember reading how some women who stood up to be possible elected representatives were subjected to gender forms of vilification, because in a way, if a woman wants to become a political leader, then there must be something unwomanly about her, and they attacked their morals and their credibility on the basis of their gender.
That's still a very patriarchal society, I must say. Even some politicians, you are even shocked when you engage with them, like they'll say, if you want to be a woman and you want to get into politics, it's an equal space, right? You must also campaign, you must also, find yourself, push forward your ideas, and people will vote for you. But then you find things like you're saying, where a woman is vilified. They use even your sex record, right? Who's been your partner, but they never use the same for the men. And you are left to wonder, is it because I'm a woman that I should have a higher moral status
Right.
than a man? It's okay for a man to cheat, but it is not okay for a woman to cheat. The
Yeah.
woman's body is a political body, and it's very
indeed.
politicized and controlled in society, which I hope would change.
So your style, your way of doing research is profoundly qualitative, I'm guessing is what you're saying, which is really appropriate, I think, for the kind of work you're doing. But you also talked about justice. Your work it drives a lot of your work. What would you say is a definition for you of gender justice?
This is a concept I've struggled with a lot in terms of how really can one define it, which is often hard to come to. But what I think is critical when we want to think of gender justice is to deal with discrimination. Any issues in society or practices or ways of being that engender discrimination amongst people, to the point that if you're a man and you're not working, people are expecting you to be working and providing it for your family. That for me is an injustice, because it's putting pressure on your manhood, right? That you become a man because you are providing for your family. But you can look at the other way, a woman who is pregnant, right? But you have not planned to have that baby. Should you still continue to carry the child to term because you have been pregnant, which I think is often a challenge that I want to deal with in my society, where it's very conservative. There is no pro-choice unless you've been raped, right? But if you found yourself with unplanned pregnancy, you're supposed to carry it to term. In a way, that is an injustice. So any aspect of our being that causes discrimination against another, it could be discrimination because you can no longer exercise your opinion, you can no longer exercise your choice. That is an injustice on your being. Because if you look closely, there's a gender dynamic to it. You are a woman, this is what you can and cannot do, which are all socially constructed. You are a man, this is what you can and what you cannot do. That inhibits you from obtaining your full potential as a being. We all want to be progressive. We all want to obtain certain aspirations we hold in life. Now, my being unable to reach my aspiration or to obtain my aspiration becomes an injustice. And that for me is what needs to be addressed from a gendered position, because you would find that certain things come from the social constructions we've had around what men and women can and cannot do, which we need to uproot.
And so I think what you're saying ties very interestingly in with the tension, I suppose, between structural approaches to discrimination, and that could include laws and economic policies, but also in your own work, working on justice at the community level. That's those spaces where the fabric of human beliefs and interactions are formed and shaped, that work also needs to happen.
It definitely needs to happen there, because you'd find that I can give you an example in Zimbabwe where they've now dealt with early child marriages by implementing a policy and a law that says you cannot, that forbids them, but socially it's still happening. So it's one thing to have policy, but it's another to change practice. So we need now to go deep into the society and understand what has been breeding this practice and what are the dangers around that practice. And then from there we start transforming it by finding other alternatives to ways of being. Because you find often we forbid something but we do not give a replacement, an alternative. And when people cannot find an alternative, because human beings are behavioral beings. They're people of behavior, habits. Now if you cannot replace a habit with another positive and progressive habit, people tend to fall back to that, what we would be calling a bad habit. So I think that's where I come in, trying to find ways to transform ways of being and uproot practices that engender discrimination. And if you look at early child marriages, the girl is now taken out probably from school, but also their projection in life becomes dwindled. Very rarely do you find that girl maybe obtaining their dreams. If they wanted to be a pilot, how do you become a pilot when you're now a mother at 16? And you're married to somebody who does not probably see value in your education. You become domesticated way earlier than you should be. And your choices in life become centered around that child, which I think is things that need to be transformed by making people realize that what we aspire for our lives might not be the same aspiration that another person has. So I should not become a hindrance to them obtaining their aspirations.
Is there anything that you could think of in stories that gives you hope for gender equality?
My mother gave birth to all 5 of us without an O level or an A level. So she got married when she was about 19 years old, and she became a mother. And then she went back to school to do her education after I was born. This was made possible because my father had been educated and saw value in upraising my mother's skills, right? Giving her the platform to reach her full potential. She wanted to be a teacher, so she went back to school. She managed to get her O level, her A level, and she went for teacher training. And then remember that those gendered roles that society expects a woman to be doing because you are married, they both managed that by having a house helper. That then enabled my mom to go back to school. But still, the house helper they got, the interesting story is that she had been removed from school because she was a girl. Her parents had said that you're a girl, we no longer have money to send you to school. And then she was like, instead of me getting married, let me get a job.
Right.
She then started staying with us as a house helper. At that same time, my mother now went to school and she had a house helper. But when my mom finished her school, she then educated the house helper as well. She went for training to do sewing and knitting because that's what she chose for herself. So you find that when people understand that we all have aspirations in life and see value in creating an enabling environment for people to reach their optimum, we transformed so many lives in the process. My mother being educated and my father being educated allowed them to earn a living that afforded us to go to, I couldn't say necessarily the best schools, but it was average schools. And from those schools, we were educated enough to be able to look after ourselves. And I mean, the chain goes on. You can see the transformation that has happened in our well-being. And similarly, you can see the same with the house helper we had, because she managed to get skills to look after herself. Even her own children now are attending better schools. That's a transformation that has happened from somebody who could have been poverty-stricken and living, in conditions that do not bring any transformation to her well-being, into a position where she gives a better future for her kids. After all, it's the future generation that has the responsibility, right, to move the country forward. If we do not give the future generation a better platform to move themselves forward, what then are we looking forward to as a better future when we've not created conducive environment now for the better future to come? So I can say, in a sense, the balanced relationship between my mother and father enabled them to achieve their optimum, and that in itself enabled their offspring to have a better starting point and achieve their optimum. I mean, all my siblings are educated. They're having their own livelihoods, which in a way helps us transform. Remember how Africa is said to be poverty stricken. How then do we transform it if we do not deal with things that hinder us from obtaining our aspirations? That's where it starts for me.
So my take-home messages, one of them from our discussion, is it takes a village to reproduce gender norms uncritically, but that same village can produce new generations that are gender equal. So thank you very much, and I really love the interview.
Thanks so much.